So let's get started. So what this workshop is about, it's about helping you or sharing my experience that I had using side projects to help my career and also improve as a programmer. So here's going to be the plan for this presentation. Whoop, here we go. So we're going to start off. I'm going to talk briefly about my journey as a programmer, where I started. Actually, it was quite difficult. I had a quite difficult start, despite the fact that I started programming at a really young age. I had trouble, lots of trouble, finding a job, and I lost my passion for coding on many occasions. And then I'm going to show you the 3 ways that I use to improve my career and turn it around to the career that I am very fortunate to have today. And because of mainly my project, you probably guessed it. And then I'm going to show you my 3 steps. So I've used those 3 steps to choose a project throughout the year, and I've been very successful in choosing those projects. And I believe it's because of those 4 steps. And it's also based on what I've seen other of my friends, many successful people do when they choose what project to work on. So that's going to be 4 steps to choose a project that is perfect for you. So that means that meets your goal and keeps you motivated to keep working on it. And then, obviously, I'm going to finish with just a quick preview of the Great Code Club to show you if you think that's something that might interest you. I'm also going to give you a discount if you're interested in joining today. So I started programming at around really young age, but at about 14 years old, I saved up all my money and bought myself my first software, which was Microsoft Visual Basic 4. It came on a set of 8 floppy disks, and it was an amazing environment for a beginner like myself to start programming. And this is where I started implementing my first few projects. So they were really, really simple projects, but still, this is where I learned about implementing ifs, using if statement, control flow structures, and a bit about Boolean logic, but not that much, right? So I started at really, really basic, and I had lots of fun and learned lots and lots of things because of those projects that I created using Microsoft Visual Basic. But naturally, after that, I was dreaming of a career in software. I wanted to have a job as a programmer and do the same kind of project I was doing on VB4. So I went to school, went to college, went to university, and started studying software in the hope of getting my dream job. But then something quite bad happened. Is during my studies in school, I lost my passion for coding, and I had no motivation to work on any more project like I was doing since I was a kid. And what happened after I finished school and I started looking for a job, I had lots and lots of trouble finding a job, actually. I went for months looking, sending out my resumes, making phone calls, but couldn't get a single job. I did eventually get one, but it was an awful job. It was using really, really dated technology in the basement of a rented space with a team of people who didn't really enjoy coding. So I felt like I was not really at my place, and I felt that I was meant for something greater, to have fun at my job and to enjoy coding like I used to when I was a kid. So that's why one days while I was working at that job, I was reminded of a quote. So knowing where you're going greatly increases your chances of getting there. So what I did on that day is I took out a sheet of paper and wrote down my goals, my career goals for the 2 to 3 years to come. So they were as follow. So I wanted to get a better job, obviously, but that meant for me at the time to work with people who were also passionate about coding. I wanted to attend software conferences to meet other passionate programmers. And I was too shy or not lacking self-confidence at that time to actually do it. And obviously, I wanted lots of people to use my code. I'm sure lots of you, even if you don't admit it, everybody wants their project or their code to be used by lots of people to feel like it's useful, like you're making a change in the world or something like that. And well, a bit pretty superficial goal, and I wanted to become a little bit known in my little sphere in the programming world. So those were my 4 goals relative to my career. So fast forward 2 years later, I had accomplished all of those goals way beyond my expectations. I released many open source projects, and the most popular one was Tin. So if you don't know, Tin is a Ruby web server that was used as the foundation of Heroku and many other cloud platforms. It has been downloaded more than 12 million times and has served billions of requests. And because of that project and all the other open source softwares that I've done too, I got invited to many conferences all over the world, oftentimes all expenses covered. And you can see I also lost a bit of hair, I gained a bit of weight, but that's not related at all. I also became known as one of the best coders in Montreal and the most respected and well-liked. And I no longer had to search for jobs or to send my resume because I had companies, including big name companies, contacting me each month, asking me to pass an interview or to apply for a job. So how did I do it? And you can too, I'm sure, is using 3 ways. So the first one that I mentioned, I already mentioned this one. I know it sounds silly, but writing down your goal is actually really effective because it forces you to focus on what you actually want to do. So I would highly recommend after this workshop to just take 5 minutes or more if you want to think about it more. Just take a sheet of paper, lay out a few years, so usually 2 or 3 is good, and just lay out your career goals, what you want to achieve. Why do you actually, so the question here is, why do you want to do side projects? Why do you want to improve and learn, right? So just don't just write, I want to do side projects and whatnot. Let's try to dig down and discover what's underneath it. Why do you want to do those projects? What do you want to accomplish? So that's my first step. And I think this helped me, although cannot be sure, but I'm sure it helped me at least to focus on where I should put my efforts. So second trick is to learn and improve. Well, actually, no. I see lots and lots of people asking me, how can I learn? How can I improve as a programmer? Well, that's the wrong thing to focus on. So don't put learn and improve on your goals. If you're doing this exercise after the workshop, don't put in 2 years, I'm going to learn, I want to improve as a programmer, because those are the two wrong things to focus on. And I discovered later that the reason I lost my passion, I lost my motivation to work on project while I was in school is because I was too focused on learning and improving. And that removed all the fun that I had prior to that, coding as a kid. So what should you do instead, right? So if you should not focus on learning and improving, well, maybe you've guessed it, is the third and most effective way to turn your career around is to work on side projects. And by working on side projects, as a consequence, you will learn and improve. Well, you will learn and improve on real things. Because if your goal, let's say, is to improve on Node.js, you improve with Node.js coding abilities. If that's just your goal, then you're just going to scratch the surface and say, hey, I've just implemented short tutorial, and that's not going to teach you much. But if your goal is to implement, let's say, a chat application using Node.js, then there's sure you're going to bang your head on some difficult problem, and only then will you master some tiny parts of Node.js. But then you'll truly have mastered those parts because of the project. And as a consequence, you will have learned and improved on Node.js. So that's just a small example. There are also many, many reasons why you should do side projects. Another good reason is if you want to improve your career, right? So if you're a programmer, or we are coders, we are programmers, so our output or what we produce on a daily basis is code, right? But if we write code at our employer while you're at your job, all of that code that you produce is owned by your employer. So whenever you leave that job and you want to apply to another job, you cannot use that code that you spend all of your time working, because that's the property of your previous employer. But all the code, all the projects you work on the side are totally owned by you. So you can use them to promote yourself. You can use that to get invited to conferences or whatever the hell you want to do with them. Those are your property, your own property. And that makes a big difference when it comes to time to apply for jobs or do whatever the hell you want to do. So this worked, those 3 tips worked for me, but not only for me. So I've had many friends and I've seen many people be very successful because of side projects. So here's just one example. Here's one of my friends, he's named Martin. Martin is actually a linguist. So he's a self-taught programmer, no formal training in programming. And Martin, so we worked at the same place. He was a junior programmer back then in Montreal. And he started doing side projects. In his side projects, he kept doing them, and he increased in complexity, also in the usefulness that provided to others. And at some point, his projects became noticed by Twitter, and Twitter offered him a visa and moved him from Montreal to San Francisco, where he actually got a job at Twitter because of his side projects, and he climbed the ladder there and became actually a senior developer at Twitter, all because of his side projects. So I know what you're thinking, right? We all have the same problem when it comes to time to work on side projects. I don't have the time to work on side project, or I don't know what to work on, right? So I totally understand what you mean here because I've had the same problems. But what you mean, what's actually the problem? What you're saying, I don't have time, is because you don't have the motivation, right? Because if you find the motivation, if you're truly passionate about a project, believe me, you're going to make time to work on that project. Even if it's 15 minutes, 5 minutes there, you're going to find a way to work on that project. So it all boils down to actually finding motivation. And if you don't know what to work on, well, actually, that's the biggest problem here, because if you don't know what to work on, of course, you're not going to have motivation. So it's all about choosing a project that will motivate you. So that's the big problem we're trying to solve here. So that's why I'm going to show you my 4 steps to choose the perfect project for you. So what I mean by perfect is a project that will motivate you, that you'll feel compelled to work on, that will passionate you enough so that you'll feel like it's worth it to actually work on that project, that you're learning, but only as a consequence of actually coding, and you're having fun working on that project. So step 1 to choosing the perfect project for you. Avoid dependencies. So I see many people doing the same mistakes all over again, is they always start a project and say, oh, I'll use that project to experiment with this and this and that technology, and they end up having a giant mud ball of technology, and they spend all of their time duct taping all that technology together and just get discouraged before they start doing any work. Right? So that's not fun to work on a giant mud ball like this, just a combination of big technology. So that's why I'm saying avoid dependencies, avoid using too many services. Now, I'm not saying don't use dependencies, don't use frameworks, or don't use libraries, but try to minimize the amount of dependencies or libraries that you're using on your project. Perhaps just focus on 1 or 2 maximum or something like that, but I would try to really minimize it to just 1 or 0 if you can manage it. So number 2, so here's an example. So I have a sheet here. So that's how I would apply that first rule to avoid dependencies when I'm describing or when I'm brainstorming my projects, right? So that's an example. I'm going to say, for example, I want to build a server. So I'm going to say I'm going to build a Ruby server from scratch, a Ruby web server from scratch. So that's going to force me to think, well, I cannot rely on a server framework or whatever it's going to be. So you're going to start from scratch and avoid dependencies as much as possible. So number 2, copy existing things, existing tools or libraries that you already know, use, and enjoy. Because chances are you probably have some ideas on how to improve it, even if it's in a tiny way. So here's how I would write it at this point. I would say I'm going to write a Ruby web server clone from scratch, right? So just copy stuff that you enjoy. If you enjoy, there's a project management app that you like, if there's a to-do app or chat app that you enjoy, just a chat app clone from scratch, or try to be more specific, right? So if you want to do like a Slack, maybe you have used the Slack chat application, so a Slack clone from scratch. But now I know what you're thinking, right? So if you're trying to clone one of those big projects, is going to end up a huge project, really difficult to maintain because there are so many features. Well, that's where my 3rd step come in. Keep it small. And I have a special, it's easy to say, but I have a special trick to keep my project small. It's also going to be a challenge, which I find usually it's an interesting challenge to put into your project. It's a constraint to say that you'll implement your project, but only in under a few lines of code. So this can vary greatly depending on your experience. It can be way more than 500, or it can be a little bit less. It also depends on the language. So don't take the number that I'm putting here for granted. It can be any other number. The important part is to put a number that is not too big but not too small, and you're going to find that number by experimenting. So if you find that if you just create the first project version of your project and you end up in 200 lines of code, well, that's probably a good idea just to put it at 200 lines of code. If it ends up being way higher than this, just try to set a number of line that is closer to the actual first version, or before the first version, you hit that one. So what's actually going to do for you is going to force you to remove features and just focus on keeping your project simpler. And also what's going to do, which is very important, is because your project is going to be smaller, you're going to be able to keep that project in your mind throughout the day. Even if you're at your job, you're walking to some place, walking your dog, doing the groceries or whatnot, running some errands, you're going to be able to think about your project because it's small enough. So that's a really important step, to always keep your projects really small, or as small as possible, or at least in the beginning phase where you're just creating your projects. So usually what I do when I'm brainstorming my project is I say, I'm going to create, for example, a Ruby web server clone from scratch in under 500 lines of code. So for example, here's the actual first open source project that I released. Not that it became popular, so that's not the point we're talking about here. But the first ever, I created many projects before that, but the first project that I open sourced and that I felt very proud of was actually an Ant clone. So Ant is a build tool for Java, but at the time I was a .NET programmer, so I ported Ant to .NET and only picked the feature that I wanted to improve. So I created an Ant clone in .NET from scratch in under 500 lines of code. And that was a really, really fun project. And that's actually the project that started me again in the path of creating all those open source projects that I released after that. I created also all the sites that I enjoyed, all the apps, the tools that I enjoyed and I admired. I cloned them and I re-implemented them in a much smaller scope. For example, I also cloned Reddit from scratch in less than 400 lines of code in Ruby. That also was a really fun project. So the last step, which is actually the most difficult step, so this one is actually not required, but this step is required if you want your project to become popular. If you want your project to be used by others, you need to provide something that will distinguish it from all the other options, obviously, right? So if you just create a web server clone, well, why should people use it? So that's why you need to focus, but on one feature that will make it way better than all the other options. So I know this sounds difficult. It is difficult, but that's the thing that will either make or break your project. But that being said, even if you don't apply that step, even if you just apply the 3 previous steps that I showed you, you still have a project that will motivate you, that will be fun to work on. Now, that step is only if you want to make an open source project that will make a change, then that will be used by people. So here was the actual initial project description of Thin, my web server. It was a Mongrel clone. So Mongrel used to be the default choice, the default Ruby server that people used at the time. So it was not really stable. It was not super fast. So I thought, hey, I'm just going to create a Mongrel clone from scratch. So no dependencies. Initial version was all written by me in under 500 lines of code, and it's going to be faster. So I focused all my efforts on keeping it small, so under 500 lines of code, and making it faster than all the other servers. Now I know faster is really tricky, so I'm not saying you should try to focus only on faster. You can focus on other things. It can be, for example, ease of use. Ease of use is a big game changer. If you want to build a tool for developers or a tool for some other people, ease of use can be a great feature to focus on. And it doesn't require lots of technical knowledge. Just require a bit of time and thinking about how people use your software. So if you see a software that is really difficult to use, just focus on making yours better, because it's going to be easier for people to get started, for example. So here's a recap of those 4 rules that I've just showed you. So choosing a project in 4 steps. Avoid dependencies as much as possible. Copy something you already know and use. Keep it small, so try to set a limit in the number of lines of code. You can also set a limit in, if you want, in kilobytes or something, if that's easier for you. Focus on one great feature if you want your project to become successful, used by other people. With all that in mind, I know it is still hard to choose a project, because that's the most difficult thing, right? That kickstarting the project, choosing which project idea we're going to spend all of our nights and some hours working on in our spare time where we could be doing sometimes something more fun is really difficult. So how do you choosing a project, even though I give you those first steps, is still difficult. And that's exactly why I created the Great Code Club. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what the Great Code Club is all about and how it can help you choose a side project that is perfect for you, that will passionate you and make it fun again to work on side projects. So here it is. So the first time that you join the club, you're going to see this screen. So that's the projects, all the projects of the club. If you're a beginner, if you're not sure, so all projects here are presented, you are implemented in JavaScript, sometimes in a browser, sometimes you need using Node.js. And we also use Git to push and pull a code for exercises and whatnot. If you're not familiar with any of those technologies, you can follow the Get Started guide here. So that's a pseudo project if you wish, that you can follow. There's a bit of videos to teach the basics of JavaScript, Git, and Node, and npm2 for installing dependencies. But here are the projects. So all projects are based on the first 3 steps of my framework for choosing the perfect project. So first of all, they use little to no dependencies. All the projects you see here are from scratch, right? So they're not implemented based, for example, here, this one implementing a 2D game, we're not relying on a library that provides a game engine or whatnot. So the first project actually I'm going to show you is to re-implement a 2D retro game, and the demo, the project we built is Pong, right? So most people know Pong. We are building this thing entirely from scratch, so no game loop library or whatever. And I show you all the basics. So the game basics, there's actually a video that teaches you all the basics you need to know about that project and how to get started. So second rule is that all of those projects are around 400 to 500 lines of code. So they're really small, so easy to get started and understand the entirety of the code base. So some are a bit difficult than others, but still the code is always under 500 lines of code. And also, you'll notice by looking at the names, once you start browsing those projects, is that they are all re-implementations of tools, frameworks, and libraries that you already know and love and use on a daily basis, right? So for example, here we have a re-implementing a 2D game, the 2D game Pong. Here we have building a transpiler. So transpiler is just a fancy word for preprocessor. So the preprocessor we implement here is actually a clone of Less CSS. Maybe you've heard about it. It's the CSS framework used by Bootstrap, so the Twitter Bootstrap project. And this project teaches you everything you need to know if you want to implement your own language. For example, some people implemented HTML template language because of that project. So the possibilities are endless with this project here. We have another one for implementing backend web framework, front-end web framework, building a server, and my favorite one is actually a little bit more advanced. So don't be scared if you're still a beginner and this seems a little bit too advanced for you. If you're a beginner, I would recommend you start off with the 2D game project, which is really easy to get started with. But this one is really close to my heart. I love talking about virtual machines and implementing virtual machines. So this one, I really love. So I'm just going to use this one to walk you through our project is presented in the Code Club. So just to give you an idea on how it's going to be, because all projects are presented in a similar fashion. So first of all, there's always going to be an introductory video that teaches you the basics that you need to know, just the bare minimum you need to start diving into the code for that specific project. And it's a video that's really similar to what I just did before with the slides. So it just slides and me talking over those slides and presenting those key concepts. And then afterwards, we usually have a few tutorials. So this one, for example, presents using bitwise operators. So because I know that not everyone is used to using those operators on a day-to-day basis. So just a quick recap of how you can use them in JavaScript and how they work and how we're going to use them to build our virtual machine. If you already know about this stuff, you can usually just skip forward to the next module. So next one is the demo of the actual project. We are implementing here, the VM we're implementing is a Chip 8 emulator. So a Chip 8 is actually, you can think of it a bit like a Game Boy emulator, only it's way, way simpler. And there's actually a demo, if you want to take a look at it, of what's going to look like, what the end product will be. And then we have the screencast in 2 parts. And if you miss any parts of this screencast, there's always a recap at the bottom here that explains exactly each of the steps that I took while recoding the old project from scratch here in this video. So it's in 2 parts. Usually all projects are presented in 2 or 3 parts in videos that go from around 15-20 minutes. So this one is a little bit longer because there's only 2, but usually it's around 15 to 20 minutes. And afterwards, there are exercises for you to try your hands on the project, to get familiar, and to force you to dive into the code. And then if you want to go a little bit forward, after you're done with the exercise, I propose a few ways that you could extend the project on your own and add new features or move it to a new direction. If you're doing that, there's also a bunch of links to resources that you can use online to build your own VM and whatnot. You can also see who's working on this project in the club. Perhaps you can ask them questions. You can contact them via the forum. So if you need any help with a project, there's always the forum that is here. You can access the forum. There's a bunch of members already. You can post some questions. There's a thread for each one of the projects here, and you can ask your questions there if you wish. There is also a chat that usually a few members, actually an IRC channel. This is just a quick way to access the IRC channel if you want to ask a question. Usually I'm online, so you can ping me there, or there's usually a few members there. But the best way to ask a question is usually the forum. Oops. So if you're wondering if this works, so this project here, there's a bunch of other ones. You can also get the description on the main site, www.greatcodeclub.com. You get a description of most of the projects you get when you join. But if you're wondering if this works, there's a page here. I'm going to send the link after this presentation. This is just an excerpt of a few of the amazing projects created by members of the Code Club. I'm really proud of this because this is the goal. This is really what the Great Code Club is all about, is to get people into creating awesome stuff like this. So what you see on screen are all projects created by members of the club after going through one of the projects that I just showed you. So we have one person created their first programming language here. Syntax looks really cool, and it compiles to JavaScript. We have lots of people who created games because somebody cloned the Flappy Bird. So that's after actually going through the 2D game project that I just showed you. We have people who implemented their own database engine, another game, a few games, a few more languages, database. Actually, somebody ported the VM project that I really like to Go. So there are lots of people who actually port the existing project to other languages, and the goal is to learn that language. So that's a really good way to learn new languages and keep it fun. Really cool demo is this one. I'm just going to show you quickly. So there's one project that is about implementing neural network. Now, I know that this sounds really complicated, but it's not. That's one of the projects of the Code Club. And as I said, the demo project is under 400 lines of code. So what neural networks are, it's actually an implementation of AI, of artificial intelligence. And what this project does is it guesses a number from images. So I can just draw here the image of a 2 and I say guess, and it's going to guess that this is the number 2. All of this because of the neural network that we implemented in the Code Club. And what this member did is he re-implemented the whole thing in his own way, in his own style. So that's totally something you can do if you want to get familiar with the project. And then he added a really nice UI on top of the project so that we can play with it. So that's really awesome. Really awesome demo here of one of the projects. So I'm going to send you a link to this page if you want to dive a little bit deeper into that.